So we're going to pick up with 7.4 on the skeletal system. So I kind of want to go back to the actual chapter. So you have the book. This is what, page 156 at the bottom. So just want to go through some of the objectives that you'll get out of this section of the book. You'll be able to list at least 5 functions of bones. Okay, so the bones are very important to our body in more ways than one, which we'll see. You'll be able to label the parts of a bone on the diagram of a long bone. Long bone is like your humerus or your femur in your leg. You'll be able to name the 2 divisions of the skeletal system and the main groups of bones in each division. You'll be able to identify the main bones of the skeleton. Compare the 3 classifications of joints by describing the type of motion allowed by each. You'll be able to give 1 example of each joint classification. Describe at least 4 diseases of the skeletal system, and then define, pronounce, and spell all key terms. So, I'm going to go back to my little PowerPoint. So, an adult body has 206 bones. When you're an infant, you actually have more than that. I think you have over 300 bones when you're an infant. But the adult has 206 bones. Okay, so it's a framework for your body. It holds everything together, gives you structure. It attaches to muscles and fat. Okay, it protects internal structures like your organs. Produces blood cells, which is very important. You can actually bleed out by fracturing a femur or your hip bone. Those are 2 very vascular bones. Very dangerous to fully break them. And then also your skeletal system stores calcium, phosphorus, and fat. So it's a major nutritional reserve for your body. So if you're ever going through a period of poor nutrition or starvation, your body will actually start leaching the nutrients out of your bones in order to satiate itself and function. So, with long bones, you have these in your extremities like your arm and your leg. Okay, there's different parts of this. Now, the diaphysis, right? Dia means complete. Okay, so this is the majority of your bone here. It's the shaft of your bone. Diaphysis. It's going to be the longest part. Epiphysis is going to be at the very end, on either end. And then you have the metaphysis in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. Okay. These are kind of where your growth plates are when you're younger. All right. Then you have your medullary cavity. That means that it houses the medulla, or the yellow and spongy bone. Okay, so the medullary cavity is here in the center. Okay. And then you have yellow marrow that makes that, or fills it, excuse me. Then you have endosteum, which is just on the inside. This is what coats the inside of the medullary cavity. Endo means inside, right? Then you have red marrow. Red marrow. Okay, so your red marrow, it's primarily responsible for producing red blood cells, among other things. But generally, when you need some sort of bone marrow transplant, it's going to be your red marrow. Then you have your periosteum. Okay, peri means around. Okay, so it's this coating around your bones. It's the outer layer. Then you have articular cartilage. Articular cartilage. And that would be found here where the joints would be. So this would be, this right here is a femur. Okay, I can tell by the shape of this. This is called a trochanter. But the articular cartilage is what is around the joints. Okay. Then we have the axial and appendicular skeleton. So these are the two different parts of your skeleton that we talked about in the objectives. So your axial skeleton is like an axis. An axis goes like straight or straight across something, right? So that's your main trunk of your body. So it's your skull, your spinal column, your ribs, and your sternum. Your appendicular is all of your extremities. Okay, so your shoulders, your arms, your pelvis, your legs. Okay. So in the skeleton, everything that's pink, this is your axial. So that's your centralized structure. Okay. And actually, your pelvis is part of your appendicular skeleton. But the purple is all of your appendicular skeleton plus your pelvis. Okay. Gives a good visual. All right. So starting with the axial skeleton, okay, we'll start with the skull. Now, we call your skull your cranium, so you'll see cranium used a lot, like cranial bones, okay? And some things to point out, you have tons of bones in your skull. It's not just one solid bone, it's a bunch of them and they're fused together. And sutures is a space in between all of your bones, okay? They turn into fissures when you're older, and they start out as sutures. And when you have a large gap or like soft spots in your head, those are called fontanelles. Okay, so that's like the soft spots in a baby's skull. All right, sinuses. All right, these are going to be openings like holes. Okay, and the foramina, these are specifically holes for something to protrude through. Okay, sinuses is like an opening like your nasal sinuses, which is like your nose, but the foramen is like these holes right here. Okay. Now, like the foramen, the parietal foramen, this is the hole in the parietal bones. So you have all these different cranial bones. Okay, now starting from the front, okay, you can tell the nose is right here. That's supposed to be the nose. So you have the frontal bone, so that's like your forehead, right? And then you have your two parietal bones. Okay, I think parietal, like parental, like your parentals are, you know, like your parents are above you, right? Okay, you look up to them. Parietal is at the very top of your head. Okay, occipital. Occipital is the bone. I guess I should turn this on the back of your head. Okay. Excuse me. Oh my goodness. Okay. Now, the sutures, which turn into fissures. Okay, so you have your coronal, like if you were to put a crown, coronal, right? Like remember in the planes, there's a coronal plane, which is like the frontal plane. All right, then you have sagittal, right? Because remember, mid-sagittal is directly in the middle. Sagittal just splits between left and right. All right, then we have the lambdoidal suture back here. Lambdoidal. All right. So if we didn't make our skull complicated enough, so we already talked about the frontal bone, the parietal. There's two, right? Because you have your sagittal suture that goes in between the two. Then you have your occipital bone in the back of your head. You also, on either side, on the left and on the right, you have a temporal bone, right? So this is in the space where you have like your temples, the opening for your temples, right? That's where your temporal bones are, okay? And then right in front of the temporal bone is the sphenoid. So the sphenoid is kind of inside of your skull a little bit. Same thing with your ethmoid, okay? Those two bones are kind of on the inside of the skull. Not as commonly known, but just as important. So now we'll get into facial bones. Let me see if I have so you have the mandible, which is your lower jaw. And maxilla, you have two of them, one on either side, okay? Like if you've ever seen anybody with a cleft palate, it's when that suture between your mandibles is not fully closed up. Or excuse me, between the two maxilla is not fully closed up. That's maxilla. Then you have your zygomatic bone, which is like your zygomatic arch. So this is your cheekbone. Okay, that's your zygomatic arch. Okay. Now, you have 5 nasal bones. These make up your nose. Okay, not your whole nose, but the actual bony part of your nose. Okay. Then you have lacrimal and palatine. So we're going to go back to this, right? So we have, starting from the bottom up, you have your mandible. This is your bottom jaw. Then you have your maxilla. Those are your tops. And notice how there's that suture there. And I talked about if you have a cleft palate, that's where there's a gap there, right? It hasn't completely closed up, which is a huge problem. It has to be surgically repaired. Then we have our zygomatic arch, our cheekbones. Okay, zygomatic. All right. And then we have lacrimal, which are kind of like right by our tear ducts. They're right by our tear duct. So if you were to try to push in at the tear duct, you'd be pushing on the lacrimal bone there. Then you have nasal bones right here. And the palatine are internal, like your hard palate at the roof of your mouth, right? That makes up part of your palatine. All right. Now, vertebra, this is your spinal column, which is still part of your axial skeleton. So from the top down, we have 26 bones, and they're separated into different groupings. Okay, and they're separated into different groupings, A, based off of where they're located, and B, based off of the shape of the bone. So we have cervical vertebra, and those are those in your neck. So like if we hold C-spine, or if we have to get a C-collar, that means it's holding the cervical vertebra in place. There's 7 of them. Okay. We protect those at all costs because if there's some sort of an injury to one of your cervical vertebrae, it could very well interfere with the drive to breathe if it pinches off or severs the nerve that supplies your diaphragm. Then you have thoracic. These are in the area of your body, kind of like your thoracic cavity, right? Your rib cage. Okay. In fact, most of these will connect to ribs. And you have 12 of them. Lumbar, this is your waist area. So remember we learned the 9 different segments of the abdomen. And in the center on the sides, that was the lumbar region, right? So that's the area of our waist. These are the largest or biggest around of the vertebra in your back. On your sacrum, you actually have one. It's a bunch of bones fused together, but we consider it one. Okay, and then you have your coccyx, which is your tailbone down here, which really is mainly cartilage, and it's where a bunch of ligaments for your lower limbs attach to for balance and control. So You can kind of remember how many bones are in each section by the time of day that you could potentially eat. Now, cervical, think like 7 o'clock in the morning. Okay. If you're, not a morning person, maybe you're not eating at 7 o'clock, but I'm a morning person, so I'm going to eat at 7. I'm going to eat breakfast at 7. I'll eat lunch at noon, and then I'll eat dinner at 5. Okay, so it kind of follows about the time that you would eat your normal 3 meals a day. 7, 12, and 5. Now, in between your vertebra are intervertebral discs. Now, this is what makes our back so flexible. These little discs in between each of the bones, those are intervertebral discs, and they allow the back to be able to bend and twist and turn. Makes us flexible. Okay, it also acts as shock absorbers because if we say like you're riding a bicycle and it doesn't have shocks on it, right? There's no suspension that softens the ride. And when you go over bumps and it's vibrating, okay, your back actually vibrates with it, and it takes that shock very well. And then last but not least, our ribs. This is the other part of our axial skeleton. Okay, it's 12 pairs of bones. Now we call them costa. Okay, like if I said you had costal chondritis, that would mean pertaining to the ribs and the cartilage having inflammation. Okay, costal chondritis. So that's just your costal region is your ribs. In between your ribs is considered intercostal, right? In between, inter. All right. So these attach to your thoracic vertebra in the back, if you can see there. Now, you have true ribs. This means that they attach to the sternum, right? So this is a true rib, true rib, true rib, true rib, true rib, right? And then these last 5 don't directly attach to the sternum. They kind of attach to the cartilage here. And then you have a couple of false ribs down at the bottom. So these mean that they don't really attach to anything. Okay. So notice how these ribs down here aren't really attached to anything. Now, we have the sternum, which is found in between the ribs on either side. Okay, so all this cartilage here, all the blue is cartilage. Okay, that all attaches to the sternum. Now there's 3 different parts to the sternum. So we have this top part, which is the large part. It's the manubrium. You can see it spelled right here, manubrium. Then we have the body of the sternum. Then at the bottom, we have the xiphoid process. Okay, this is mainly cartilage, and it can be broken off accidentally with trauma. But those are the 3 parts of the sternum. Okay. All right, so our collarbone, this bone right here at the top of our chest, that's called a clavicle. We have 2 of them, one on either side. And then we have 2 scapula, which is your shoulder blade on your back. Scapula. Okay. On your upper arm bone, so your humerus actually attaches to your scapula. All right. All right, so you can see this here. Your scapula is in the back. This would be like a right arm. Okay, and this is the humerus, which is the upper right arm bone. And it attaches right there to the scapula, that joint. That's the shoulder joint. Now, this is your upper arm bone. In your lower arm, which is in between your elbow and your wrist, okay, you have 2 bones. Now, I want you to think of anatomical position. So if you had your hand out facing forward, the bone that attaches to your thumb is your radius. The bone that attaches to your pinky is your ulna. Okay, so This is the radius, which attaches to the thumb side, and then the ulna, which attaches to the pinky side. When we get down into the hand, the wrist bones are called carpals. Like if you have carpal tunnel, that means that you have your carpals are either inflamed or damaged in some way, shape, or form, and it causes pain there in the wrist. Sometimes numbness or tingling or weakness in the hands. But your carpals are your wrist bones. Then you have your metacarpals. These are the bones that go through like the main part of your hand. Okay, and then you have phalanges. Now, funny thing about phalanges, they're your fingers, but they're also called your toes, right? Your toes are phalanges and your fingers are phalanges. Interesting. Okay. I'm going to pick up with bones of the pelvic girdle on the next video, but we managed to get through the axial skeleton, which consists of your skull and your vertebra and your rib cage and your sternum. And then we started to get to our appendicular skeleton, which is our arms, our legs, our hips. Okay, so we'll pick up with pelvic girdle on the next video.